Darren Malley was from a broken home in East London, but by the time he was 40, he had become the most feared cocaine kingpin in the UK, ruling an empire built on silence, loyalty and ruthless control. His rise was unstoppable, but as rivals closed in and the police tightened their grip, Darren faced a choice: protect everything he'd built or vanish before it all came crashing down. In 1985, under the overcast skies of East London, Darren Malley was born into a world already teetering on the edge. His first home was a crumbling council flat in Barking, wedged between shuttered shops and the constant hum of police sirens. Life there wasn't just hard, it was hopeless. His father, a bitter man broken by years of dead-end work on the docks, drowned his frustrations in alcohol. Most nights ended in shouting, thrown bottles, and silence thick with resentment. His mother disappeared before Darren turned 5, leaving behind nothing but a passport photo and a note no one ever talked about. No relatives came, no one knocked to check in. It was just Darren and a father who barely noticed he was there. School was an afterthought. Darren stopped going regularly by the time he was 12. No one chased him. The teachers didn't care, and the system had long since given up on boys like him. Instead, he found a different kind of education on the streets outside. He watched older kids in shiny tracksuits, handing out raps behind the estate bins. He saw how money moved hands quickly, how fear gave you space, and how no one asked questions when you wore confidence like armor. At 13, he started running messages for a local dealer. By 15, he was holding bags, making deliveries, and learning how to disappear in plain sight. But Darren wasn't just another kid playing gangster. He didn't get high on his own product, didn't chase status with designer gear or loud talk. He watched, always quiet, always calculating. Where others jumped at the chance to flash money, Darren was already thinking 2 steps ahead. He knew this life wasn't about luck. It was about discipline, about control. The kind of control he never had at home, never had at school, but felt every time someone looked over their shoulder when they heard his name. By 17, he was done being a runner. He wanted his own turf, his own crew, and his own rules. In a world where most burned out fast, Darren was just getting started. Not because he wanted the life, but because he couldn't survive anything else. By the time Darren Malley turned 20, he had outgrown the estate corners and schoolyard dealers who had once loomed large in his world. Most of the boys he came up with were either dead, locked up, or stuck pushing small bags for someone else. Darren had no intention of being one of them. His moves were quieter now, more deliberate. He recruited 2 childhood friends, men he trusted not because they were smart, but because they were loyal. That was enough in the early days. They started with local weed suppliers, selling ounces to college students and small-time dealers around East London. The money was steady, but it wasn't life-changing, not yet. What changed everything was a chance connection through an older cousin, doing time in Belmarsh. The cousin introduced Darren to a Turkish contact, an importer with ties to Eastern European traffickers who were smuggling cocaine through the docks. It was a dangerous connection, but Darren saw the opportunity instantly. This wasn't about a few grand a week anymore. This was about scale, about control. He offered to help distribute small shipments across East London using local crews who owed him favors. The plan worked. His product was clean, his operation tight, and unlike other dealers, Darren paid on time, every time. Word spread quickly. As the network grew, so did the profits. Darren reinvested every pound back into the business. He bought cars, not to drive, but to use as stash vehicles. He rented flats under fake names to serve as safe houses. Every detail was thought through, every risk was weighed. He refused to keep drugs or cash in his own home, and he changed phones every 2 weeks. His face was rarely seen, and when it was, it never lingered. He wasn't looking for attention. That's what made him dangerous. Within 2 years, Darren was no longer a dealer, he was a supplier. Other crews came to him for stock. He set the price, chose the weight, and moved in shadows while others fought for scraps in the open. He wasn't the loudest or the most feared, not yet, but he was the most respected, and in the drug world, respect lasts longer than fear. Darren knew that. It was the first rule he wrote for himself, and he followed it like scripture. By the age of 30, Darren Malley had transformed from a street-level hustler into one of the most efficient cocaine suppliers in the UK. What had started as a few local deals in East London had grown into a nationwide operation, from quiet suburbs in Manchester to nightclubs in Bristol. Darren's product was moving clean, consistent, and always on time. His network had no name, no flashy branding, and no online presence. That was the point. It was invisible, and invisibility was power. He ran everything like a business. His dealers didn't use slang or draw attention. Orders were made through encrypted apps. Communications were broken into layers. No one ever knew the full chain. If a phone got tapped, it led nowhere. His stash houses were scattered across the city in rented flats, many of them unoccupied, except for the hidden floorboards packed with vacuum-sealed kilos. Even the couriers were clean. Former delivery drivers with no criminal records and everything to lose. To outsiders, Darren looked like a man who had finally gone straight. He wore tailored suits instead of tracksuits, drove a modest black Range Rover, and told anyone who asked that he was in property. He had real businesses too, small construction firms that bid on government contracts, a few car washes, a handful of rental properties. These weren't just for show. They were part of a complex web designed to clean millions in drug money. Everything flowed through offshore accounts, shell companies, and fake invoices. It was all paper thin, but legal enough to hold up at a glance. Despite the success, Darren stayed paranoid. He kept his circle tight and rotated locations constantly. No meeting ever happened in the same place twice. He trusted almost no one. His only weakness was control. He had to manage everything personally. Every deal, every route, every payment. It was exhausting, but it was the only way he knew. The drug world was filled with chaos, ego, and bloodshed. Darren's world wasn't. His rules were strict. No street-level beef, no unnecessary violence, no flashy behavior. That discipline kept him safe while others fell. It was why police had heard his name, but couldn't touch him. He wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. He was a businessman, one whose product just happened to be cocaine. In 2016, everything changed with one phone call. A major shipment, over 3 million pounds worth of high-grade cocaine, had vanished somewhere between Birmingham and East London. No police activity, no crashes, no alerts. The van simply never arrived. For a man like Darren Malley, whose entire empire depended on precision and control, this wasn't just a setback. It was a breach of everything he had built. The shipment had been handled by Reese, Darren's Birmingham lieutenant. Reese was loud, flashy, and reckless. Everything Darren despised, but he moved weight, and until now, he had delivered without fail. Darren had given him too much rope, and now it was tightening around his own neck. The missing load meant not just a loss in profit, but potential blowback from suppliers expecting payment. In Darren's world, a mistake this big could spark a chain reaction. He didn't act immediately. Instead, he watched, waited, let the panic settle among his people. Reese swore he had no idea what happened, blaming a driver who'd since vanished. But Darren didn't buy it. Reese had been expanding too quickly, making side deals, building a name for himself. Darren didn't tolerate ambition that didn't serve him. 3 days later, Reese was found floating face down in a canal outside Dudley. No signs of struggle, except his tongue had been cut out. Word spread fast. No one dared to ask questions. The message was clear. Betrayal would be met with silence. Not violence for show, but violence with meaning. Darren didn't just eliminate problems, he erased them. After Reese's death, the rest of the Birmingham crew fell back in line, and Darren personally oversaw the restructuring of the route. He tightened everything, cutting off anyone he couldn't control directly. Trust, once given freely, was now a rare currency. But the betrayal did more than just cost him a shipment. It forced Darren to look closer at his own organization. For the first time, he saw cracks. Too many people were getting comfortable. Too many were getting greedy. He began to realize something he hadn't wanted to admit. The empire he'd built, so carefully and quietly, was starting to rot from the inside. And the rot always spreads faster than you think. For years, Darren Malley had operated like a ghost, seen by few, touched by none. He didn't use his real name in any deals, never kept product in his own properties, and made sure the money never moved directly through his hands. It was a structure built to outlast investigations, designed to stay a step ahead of law enforcement. But even the most perfect machine begins to wear down under constant pressure. And the pressure was building. Unknown to Darren, the National Crime Agency had been quietly building a file on him for nearly 5 years. They didn't have photos of him with drugs. They didn't have texts or calls directly linking him to a shipment. But they had something better: patterns. Unusual property purchases. Shell companies with no employees. International bank wires, with no clear business purpose. The numbers didn't lie, and while Darren had cleaned his money well, he hadn't cleaned it perfectly. Then came the break they'd been waiting for. Darren's longtime accountant, a man known only as Martin in court documents, was caught in a completely unrelated financial probe involving fraudulent tax claims. Facing a mountain of charges and a potential 20-year sentence, Martin did what most men in his position do: he flipped. At first it was vague information. Mentions of offshore accounts, details about fake invoices, companies that didn't exist. But slowly, under pressure, he gave up more. Not enough to arrest Darren, but enough to map the outline of the entire operation. The NCA began tapping phones, watching safe houses, following couriers. They placed undercover officers on the outskirts of Darren's distribution chain. Small-time dealers were arrested and squeezed for information. Some cracked, most didn't. But the walls were closing in. The agency didn't want just a few arrests. They wanted the top, and Darren was now firmly in their sights. Inside the network, whispers began to circulate. Phones were going silent. Certain addresses were suddenly abandoned. Darren noticed the changes, but he couldn't trace them. It felt like something was moving just beyond his reach. He tightened the network, demanded loyalty, and cut ties with anyone acting strange. But it was already too late. The hunt had begun, and Darren didn't even know he was being hunted. While Darren Malley focused on tightening his operation and staying ahead of the law, a new threat was rising, not from the police, but from the streets. A younger, more aggressive crew had begun making moves in North London. They were based in Tottenham, built on violence, and hungry for territory. Unlike Darren's disciplined, secretive style, they thrived on chaos. Guns, social media threats, and broad daylight attacks were their calling cards. They weren't just trying to get rich. They were trying to make a name. At first, Darren dismissed them. They were kids, loud and sloppy. But when 2 of his couriers were hijacked in 1 week, and a warehouse in Leytonstone was raided with no police involved, he realized this was no coincidence. The Tottenham crew wasn't just attacking random targets, they were attacking him. They started offering cheaper product on Darren's turf. Dealers who had worked with him for years were now being lured away with promises of better prices and faster delivery. Darren's name, once enough to silence any rebellion, his presence was growing. Some of his longest-standing men were beginning to act differently, taking longer to respond, asking more questions, checking over their shoulders more than usual. Darren, once known for controlling every detail, now found himself chasing fires he couldn't put out. The Tottenham crew wasn't the real danger, it was what they represented: a changing world, a new era. One Darren had no part in building. He had ruled for too long, and the streets were letting him know nothing lasts forever. By 2020, Darren Malley's empire was no longer expanding, it was shrinking. The streets he once controlled were now fractured, policed by younger crews with louder voices and less fear. The police were circling closer, his rivals were growing bolder, and his own crew was losing faith. Darren, once a ghost in the criminal world, had become a man on the run without ever leaving the city. He retreated into a high-rise flat in Canary Wharf, a fortress disguised as luxury. The flat was outfitted like a safe house. Steel-reinforced doors, surveillance feeds covering every hallway, encrypted Wi-Fi, and 2 armed men stationed outside 24/7. No one came up without clearance. No one left without being searched. From inside, Darren monitored everything: calls, drops, cash flow. His world had shrunk to 4 walls and a dozen screens. He wasn't building anymore. He was managing collapse. He trusted no one now. Meetings were cancelled or moved to video calls with voice distortion. Phone numbers were changed weekly. Some of his old allies had vanished without warning. Others had been arrested. Rumors spread that at least 2 had turned informant. Darren didn't know who to believe, so he believed no one. Even his closest lieutenant, a man he'd once considered family, hadn't been allowed into the flat for months. But the paranoia was justified. His couriers were getting pulled over more often. One of his money men had disappeared from Spain, never to be seen again. Another was picked up at Heathrow, trying to leave with a fake passport. The police weren't guessing anymore. They were targeting, and Darren knew exactly what that meant. Someone was talking. Yet he refused to run. Not yet. He believed there was still a chance to recover. He tried to rebuild broken lines, cut deals with former enemies, even floated the idea of partnering with some of the younger crews. But no one bit. His silence had once made him powerful. Now, it just made him alone. Inside that glass tower, watching the city lights flicker far below, Darren began to understand the truth. He hadn't just built an empire, he'd built a cage. And now the walls were closing in from every direction. Darren Malley had always been a man who planned for every possible outcome, and by 2020 he had prepared his escape. Deep within a vault, hidden behind layers of false walls and coded locks, tucked away in a remote part of Romania, lay his ticket out, a new identity, forged with painstaking detail. There were passports with different names, bank accounts funded with clean money, and a villa on the Black Sea coast, waiting for him to disappear into the sun and forget the dark life he had led. The plan was simple. One day, when the pressure became unbearable, Darren would walk away from everything. No more running couriers, no more encrypted phones, no more safe houses. He would vanish, trading his hard-earned empire for a quiet life far from London's shadowed streets. But there was a catch. To leave, he had to trust someone. Someone to handle his remaining business, to cover his tracks, to ensure that the police and rival gangs never traced him. And trust had become a rare commodity. For weeks, Darren wrestled with the decision. Stay and fight for the crumbling empire, risking arrest or death. Or vanish quietly, leaving everything behind but his freedom. The thought of losing control was unbearable. The empire had been his way out of a broken childhood, his shield against the powerlessness that had haunted him. But now, that empire was burning. One last shipment, he told himself. One last deal to settle debts and secure the future. If that succeeded, he would leave. But as the days stretched on, the plan began to unravel. Members of his crew stopped answering calls. Safe houses were compromised. Police raids grew more frequent. Every step forward felt like sinking deeper into quicksand. Darren's hesitation, once his greatest strength, became his biggest weakness. The longer he stayed, the closer the net tightened. And then came the warning. A coded message slipped through a trusted courier. The police were closing in on the flat. His Romanian contacts had been compromised. The escape route was no longer safe. Now, trapped between loyalty to his fading empire and the chance to save himself, Darren faced the ultimate choice. Risk everything to protect what was left, or walk away before it all burned down around him. The line between life and death had never been thinner. In early 2022, the carefully constructed world Darren Malley had built for nearly 2 decades came crash down in a matter of hours. The National Crime Agency, armed with months of surveillance, informant testimony, and financial evidence, executed a series of coordinated raids across the country. 17 properties linked to Darren's network, from safe houses in East London to warehouses in Manchester, were stormed simultaneously. The operation was ruthless and efficient, designed to leave no chance for escape. Darren's safe house in Canary Wharf was the last target. By then he was already a shadow of the man he had been worn down by years of paranoia and loss. When officers broke down the door, they found him sitting calmly in his living room, unarmed and dressed in a simple tracksuit, staring blankly at the flickering screens that monitored his empire. The fear that once ruled his world was replaced by a strange quiet acceptance. His reign was over. Over the following months, the legal battle began. Prosecutors painted Darren as the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated drug operations in UK history. They detailed the routes, the methods of money laundering, and the dozens of men and women who worked beneath him. But through it all, Darren remained silent. He refused to name names, refused to cooperate, and refused to betray the few people he still trusted. The trial captivated the nation. To some, Darren was a criminal kingpin, a man responsible for flooding the streets with cocaine and destruction. To others, he was a cautionary figure, a product of a broken system and a harsh upbringing, trapped by the very empire he created. The media dubbed him the accountant, a nod to his cold, calculated approach to crime. When the judge handed down the sentence, it was life imprisonment with no parole for 30 years. Darren's world had shrunk to the four walls of a maximum security prison in Yorkshire, far from the bustling streets where he once ruled. Outside, his empire lay in ruins, assets seized and alliances broken. Yet despite the fall, Darren's name did not disappear. In the shadows of London's underworld, his story became legend, a grim reminder of the thin line between power and ruin and the cost of crossing it. Years after Darren Malley's arrest, the reverberations of his empire continued to echo through the streets of London and beyond. The once tightly controlled network had splintered into fragments, each piece fought over by rival gangs eager to claim what remained. The carefully maintained order Darren had built was gone, replaced by chaos and violence. The streets that had once fallen silent out of respect now roared with gunfire and turf wars. But Darren's story wasn't just about the fall of a kingpin, it was about the fragile boundary between survival and destruction. He had risen from a broken home, a lost boy in East London, to become a figure who shaped the city's underworld for decades. His rise and fall revealed more than just the workings of a drug empire. It exposed the cracks in society, the failures of institutions, and the harsh realities faced by those trapped in cycles of poverty and violence. In prison, Darren became a figure both respected and feared. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with a clarity that surprised many. Fellow inmates listened, knowing this was a man who had seen the highest peaks and the darkest depths. Some said he'd changed, that the boy from Barking who never had a chance had finally found peace behind bars. Others believed the empire still lived inside him, a ghost whispering secrets to those on the outside. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies studied his case closely. Darren's methods inspired new strategies for tackling organized crime, focusing less on flashy arrests and more on dismantling the financial networks that sustained it. His downfall became a blueprint, a warning that even the most hidden operations could be uncovered with patience and precision. For the communities Darren left behind, his story was a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that beneath every headline about drugs and violence, there was a human life shaped by hardship, choices, and consequences. The white line between life and death that Darren walked was one crossed by many, but few survived long enough to tell the story. In the end, Darren Malley's legacy was not just about crime or power. It was about survival in a world that rarely gave him a chance.